Hi, my name is Dr. Eric Landrum from the Department of Psychology at Boise State University, and this is a screencast about the characteristics of good science, part of the research methods course. So let's go ahead and get started. So basically, you have to start off with some definitions as usual. And this is a term that you're familiar with, I'm sure, for much of your life. What is science? I want to give you a little bit more formal definition. It's from the Latin word scientia, which translates as knowledge. And so science is a method of gaining knowledge about the universe through empirical observation. And so you've probably learned back in fifth grade science class about the scientific method and the 5 steps, and we're going to review that in a moment. But there's a scientific method, and that gives us information about the world that has been prepared in a certain way following certain methods. And so empirical, by the way, there in that second bullet means research based. And so as opposed to kind of a rational armchair rationalizing how the world works, the scientific method means that you go out into the world and you conduct tests or measures or experiments about what works and what doesn't. Science is also a body of knowledge about the world we live in that's arrived at through empirical observation. And so science is both a method and a product. And so and you've seen this before on a Facebook survey or a magazine survey. The results of this study are not scientific. And so we've got knowledge that is scientific knowledge and knowledge that's not scientific, as well as methods of gaining knowledge about the world. And so really the key thing here is to remember that science is both a method and a product. And so you can see here on the left, the typical 5 steps that you might have learned in a US fifth grade science class and maybe you remember this, where you had the styrofoam cup and some dirt and a seed, and there were 20 kids in that class, and they all had the same cup, the same dirt, the same seed, but 10 of you put your cups with your name on it along the windowsill, and the other 10 put it in the teacher's cabinet that was dark. And so 10 days later, you got them out and you measured with your rulers and you were practicing graphing and all that good stuff. That's that same scientific method where you generated a problem, you formed a hypothesis, you conducted an experiment, you collected data, you drew a conclusion. That's the exact same thing that psychologists do today. We don't label those steps the same way. We don't call it 5 steps, we call it 4 steps, but you can see that exact same stepwise progression when you look at a psychology empirical research article and you see the introduction, the method, the results, and the discussion section. And so that same scientific method that you learned about way back in grade school is the exact same scientific method that psychological scientists use to advance our knowledge of human behavior. So, it's knowledge about what? Well, there are some underlying assumptions that are kind of important to us if we're going to make sense of the world through a scientific lens. So we want knowledge about the orderly relationships that exist between events. And we tend to believe, as psychological scientists, that although we may not always be able to uncover the cause, that there actually is a cause, that there are some things that happen randomly, but most of behavior has a cause and therefore an effect. So the critical assumption for most scientists of all stripes really is that orderly relationships exist and everything has a cause. And our ultimate goal would be to find out the cause of Alzheimer's disease, the cause of clinical depression, the cause of college student success, the cause of workplace satisfaction. And so we do have some underlying assumptions, and that assumption is called determinism. So if you are a determinist, and by the way, not that it matters, but I am, you believe that everything occurs as a function of a finite, not infinite, but a finite series of causes. And if I knew all the causes of something, an event would be completely predictable. Another way to say this in terms of determinism is that, in other words, everything is caused and nothing happens randomly. So if I knew all the causes of clinical depression, that I could predict then who's going to have it, who's going to get it, who doesn't, its onset, its remission. If I knew all the causes of depression, I would be able to predict its occurrence with 100% certainty. Just like if I knew all the causes of a tornado, I could predict when they touch down with 100% certainty. And so the deterministic viewpoint means that there are underlying factors or causes that drive events in the future. Now, of course, there's a flip side to this, as there always is, and that's called free will. So the alternative belief is free will. That is, someone who believes in this exclusively believes that behavior is determined by humans and not by a series of causes. That is, everything happens randomly. And certainly there are some random events that happen in our lifetimes that are outside of our control and certainly not part of something that we have caused, but yet they occur. And I think, psychologists have kind of reconciled this. This isn't an all or none. You're not either a determinist or a free willian. I think that I just made that up. Believer in free will, but usually you're a determinist and you realize that one of the potential causes is something random that we'll never understand. And so again, this is kind of a different version of job security. That is, psychologists can study the deterministic causes of behavior, but odds are we're never going to be able to predict something with 100% certainty because one of those causes in that list is going to be free will, is going to be a randomness that happens in our lives that we don't have any control over. So this launches us into this notion of characteristics of good science. And the listing I'm about to give you, and I think it's about 12 items long, it really highlights the difference between scientific knowledge, that comes from the scientific method, and other types of knowledge. And that little box over there to the right, I show you, and this is actually in your readings as well, there's other ways that we learn about the world. We learn about the world through authority figures, through logic, through intuition, through tenacity. But the way that we learn about the world that we're going to focus on, obviously, in this course is that scientific approach, the characteristics of good science. And so that scientific knowledge that's based on a certain rules of evidence and data collection. And also, I should point out to you that if you've already watched the screencast on critical thinking, that some of these items overlap perfectly with that. And so this list is not mutually exclusive of the topics covered in that screencast. If you think about it, it makes really good sense that, critical thinking is the big overall kind of overarching rubric, if you will, and characteristics of good science. We're kind of narrowing it down to a more scientific approach. And, for the remainder of the semester, we're really going to narrow it down to psychological research methods. But this is kind of a nice kind of broad overview that kind of helps you fit psychology among all the other sciences and how we view the world, how we make decisions, how we test hypotheses, and so forth. And so I just kind of want to walk you through these characteristics of good science. So, and this is very similar to what you heard in the critical thinking screencast. Skepticism is an essential tool for gaining knowledge. We want to ask those what if questions. What would happen if this happened or that sequence preceded this other sequence? So skepticism, being willing to wonder, being puzzled by human behavior, this is an essential tool for gaining knowledge about the world that we live in. And actually, it's kind of nice that it actually spells out here in number 2. Another characteristic of good science is that an open mind is combined with critical thinking. And so we might have a tentative hypothesis. We have some beliefs based on the current data, but we're going to be willing to change those on the basis of changing data. That's that notion from the critical thinking screencast about tolerating uncertainty. So an open mind is combined with critical thinking as part of good science. Third, and again, this is going to overlap nicely with the critical thinking screencast, repeatability is required. We might call this replication or reproducibility. The outcomes must be replicated. And I think this is the classic phrase from science. If it hasn't happened twice, it hasn't happened. And there's a snippet of an article that you might be reading this semester where there was a classic replication attempt in 2015 where 100 different studies were replicated. And the good news is that psychologists put a lot of effort into replicating, which is a very good practice, as you can see. It's part of good science. The unfortunate news was, and it's really kind of interesting, is that only about 36% of the studies that were replicated actually found the exact same results. And some of the ones that weren't replicated were because of probably a low sample size or maybe just a marginal effect. The effect wasn't very strong. It was kind of moderate or weak. And so those big, large effects in prior studies carried through for the most part. And so this is just a really good practice that I think, to be honest with you, has kind of fallen by the wayside for many psychologists until this article and this series of open science initiatives were initiated recently. And so, we're kind of getting back to these good practices with regards to research methods as a discipline on the whole. Another characteristic of good science is testability. In other words, we've got to be able to either accept or reject an idea for it to be a testable idea. And I'll circle back to this later on in this screencast when I talk a little bit about what are the types of hypotheses to be tested, what's testable and what's not testable. So if I can't support or refute the hypothesis, then it's probably not a good testable hypothesis for us. Another characteristic of good science is compatibility with existing knowledge. This has a fancy name. It's called subsumptive power. So in other words, if I'm studying something in developmental psychology and I come along and I have a new finding, I have to make my findings fit in the context of 100 plus years of research that led up to my findings. In other words, I can't come along as a researcher and say, forget about the first 100 years of developmental psychology. They were all wrong. I'm right. Therefore, follow me and believe in the findings that I have before you. That doesn't happen. Good science has subsumptive power. So either I've got to say, here's my findings, and they're a new twist on what's happened in the past, or I could come along and say, you know what, as I looked at the past research, I saw some flaws. So here's the reasons why I don't believe parts of the past ought to be believed. Therefore, I improved on that, and here's the results of that study. So you have to make it fit. Either the past kind of made some mistakes and now you've corrected them, or your new results are kind of a different twist and that they are in sync with, they have this subsumptive power with prior research. Number 6 in our lineup of characteristics of good science is called falsifiability. It's sometimes called the principle of refutability. It's called falsificationism. And it comes from a guy named Sir Karl Popper. And if you've had your Psych 295 statistical methods class, and you should as a prerequisite to this course, you've already kind of dealt with this before when you talked about accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. And also, by the way, for some folks, it's either rejecting or failing to reject. Now, I'll be honest with you, I liked accept versus reject, but technically speaking, it's reject or fail to reject. So just kind of remember that in the back of your mind. Anyway, here's the notion. And it's kind of complicated and it's kind of backwards for students at first until you really practice with this concept and wrap your head around it. So here we go. So when we do hypothesis testing, when we do it in statistics, when we do our research methods, we actually start with the presumption that nothing's going on. We start with the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis means there's no difference between the groups, there's no association or relationship between the variables, there's nothing going on. So what we try to do is our goal, our typical goal, is to reject the null. So if the null says there's nothing going on, I want to reject the null and say there's something going on. So experiments and experimenters try to falsify the null by finding differences. If we're successful, typically speaking, we reject the null hypothesis. And so it's kind of like setting up a straw man and then trying to knock him down kind of thing. It's not that we're going to prove anything, but we're going to disprove incorrect theories. And I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me show you that on the next screen. So we're still talking about this falsifying data, and I love this example from Newell. So let's say that I did start with a hypothesis that said all swans are white. Well, here's the thing: to prove, and if you could see me, I have air quotes, to prove that all swans are white, I'd have to round up every swan in the world and check them and make sure that they're all white. However, if I find not one non-white swan of any other color other than white, I have very easily disproven the hypothesis that all swans are white. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the essence of falsificationism. We are never going to prove a hypothesis in psychology, but we're going to disprove all the other competing theories and hypotheses that there's only one left standing. I can't prove something for all cases, but I can easily disprove alternative theories that may not be supported, that might be incorrect. Think of it as kind of playing King of the Hill, if you've ever played that as a kid. So you're at the top of that dirt heap, and what we do is that we're not ever going to get to the hill, but we're going to knock down every competitor so that the only thing left standing must be the hypothesis that we're going to support for now, tentatively speaking. And so if you in your if you are in research methods and you use the term prove, I'm going to gently correct you and say, remember, we don't prove anything, we disprove. And if I slip and use that, then I want you to gently correct me and say, no, Dr. Landrum, we don't ever prove anything, we disprove. I mean, it's kind of an easy slippage, and if you watch television or commercials on TV, you'll see sometimes, clinical research has proved, and actually, real clinical researchers never prove. But folks in the marketing department might want to say, this is a proven solution for headaches. Well, technically speaking, that's not what scientists do. So I like that explanation at the end of that slide where it says, although a theory is never proven, we can falsify it, then we force ourselves to look again and come up with a better one. And so that's that notion of that academic king of the hill, if you will. I'm never going to prove what causes Alzheimer's disease. If I disprove enough theories, I'm pretty much going to have only one theory left standing, and that's the one I'll operate on until other new data comes along. Just one more chance at this because it takes students a while to wrap their head around it. So we don't prove things, we disprove, and it kind of sounds like doublespeak, sounds like gobbledygook, but it's actually fundamentally a part of being a scientist and thinking scientifically. So here it is one more time. Science is based on disproving hypotheses. That is, we set something up and we tend to falsify it. We tend to reject the null. If we reject the null, it means we found something. A major role of science is disproving incorrect theories. Science and psychology never prove a theory, but we may find a hypothesis to be not false. Now notice even that sounds a little bit odd. How come I didn't say true? Well, we're never really going to prove something to be true, but we might find something to be not false. I know that sounds twisted, but I think in essence you understand this. If you understand the idea of someone who is found not guilty by a jury trial might not necessarily be innocent, then you get this. It's the same type of concept. And so just because someone is found not guilty by a jury doesn't mean that they're truly innocent. Well, just because we said that a hypothesis is not false does not exactly mean that it's true. And so if you can buy into the logic on one hand, that's the same kind of logic that we're going to use here. And again, as we go through the course, we practice with this and we write hypotheses, we test them, we conduct statistical analyses. I hope as you interact with this concept more, it'll become more of a second nature to you. All right, so we've kind of beat this thing to death. And so here's one other explanation. We go out on a limb and we predict what's going to happen. We predict that certain things are not going to happen. And so in other words, we're going to make a prediction which can be tested and it can be either accepted or rejected. There has to be able to, good science has a decision point. If the only thing you can do is accept the null, that's not good science. If the only thing you can do is reject the null, that's not good science. A really good scientific hypothesis must be able to be accepted or rejected, supported or refuted. And that's what that's saying there. Okay, let's move on to another characteristic of good science. Good science uses specific language. And you see the meme, the Mark Wahlberg meme here. And I love this. You can find this on the internet. It's called Research Mark Wahlberg. Somebody runs a Twitter site and a Facebook page. But as I can in this course where appropriate, I will introduce these memes. I think they're great. It's not you, it's me. And so someone has turned these images from movies and TV shows that he's done, and they've turned them into research methods memes, and they're awesome. And I will try to incorporate them as much as I can. So good science uses specific language. We talked about that in our screencast about critical thinking. We talked about operational definitions. And we remember that image of that Mongolian barbecue and that bowl of noodles, and the height of that might be one of our measures of hunger as an operational definition. Good science is empirical, meaning that it's research based. In other words, although psychology came out of philosophy, psychology is an empirical science. That is, we go out and we conduct studies, we do research, we do observations, we test hypotheses. We don't sit back and think about whether or not they should be true or not. We actually go out and try to collect data, either quantitative or qualitative, and figure out if there's support for a hypothesis or not. Good science has controlled experiments, and honestly, That's the essence of this course. Research methods, you're going to learn about the methodology and different types of research designs, either through the screencasts, through your textbook readings, or through our interactions in class together. And so it's all about these controlled experiments with between groups designs, within groups designs, and these concepts that allow us to make the most powerful conclusions possible depending on the type of data analysis situation that we're in. Another characteristic of good science is that it guards against experimenter effects. And this is the clever Hans story. And I'm not going to go into this, but if you just Google clever Hans, if you read in your textbook about this, you know, sometimes the experimenter wants the experiment to occur so badly, or maybe it's part of their thesis or dissertation, or they believe in it. Sometimes consciously or unconsciously, we can give cues to participants in a study that actually might influence their behavior. And so there's a recent book by Heinsohn, Lilienfeld, and Nolan about this. Really interesting book. I highly recommend it. And the Clever Hans story is a good read. And so dig into that and look into this notion of we want to be sure as experimenters that we're not contaminating the research study that we're trying to do. We want to be objective and as distant and objective as we possibly can be. Finally, good science is self-correcting. I think the replication studies are a great example of that because we found out that some studies that were once done, once repeated, we couldn't get the exact same effects. And then the idea is to explore why. Was it a really a tight methodological replication where some things changed because they had to be changed? I mean, was it just maybe the effect size wasn't there that we thought was there prior? And so good science is self-correcting. Occasionally fraud will creep in. And those fraudulent claims, hopefully, in good science are found. And so, whether as someone has made an honest error and then it's corrected in a journal article, or someone's been openly deceptive and purposely committed fraud, ideally those things come to light. And good science over time will correct for that. And quite honestly, replication is one of the best tools to be able to do that. If something, that classic saying, if it hasn't happened twice, it hasn't happened. And finally, on this list, good science produces knowledge. And that's kind of important because if I do this great study and I collect all this data and I do the proper analyses and I write up everything in an APA format and I'm doing real science and it really matters and I put it in a file folder and I put it in a filing cabinet and I lock it in my office, that's not good science. Good science is meant to be shared. You submit to a journal and hopefully you publish a journal article. You go to a conference and present a paper or a poster. You share it on a website. You write a book chapter. You write a book. Good science produces knowledge. Good science that just doesn't get done and put in a file folder or filed away in a Dropbox archive. And so good scientists are going and sharing their results with other scientists, and that's how we can advance the discipline one study at a time. Kind of as we wrap things up here, some cautions about science. So science deals in probabilities, and if you've had that statistical methods course, you know that we're going to draw conclusions, and so we're going to admit that there's a chance of being wrong. In political science, they do this when they say things like plus or 3% margin of error. Our margin of error is typically going to be about 5%. And so we're going to always admit when we draw a conclusion, especially an inferential conclusion, that there's a chance of being wrong, p less than 0.05. Science clearly has limits. We're only as good as our sensory tools and those technologies that we have to augment them. In other words, we can only see out into the galaxy with the strongest telescope available. We can only see the smallest part of neuronal functioning in an axon with the best microscopes available. And so we have to rely on our sensory systems to see and observe and take in the world around us. So there's limits. So for example, we know that there are tones in the sound spectrum that are below our audible spectrum and they're above. And so sometimes dogs can hear sounds that humans can't, and so on. So we're only as good as our tools and the technology we have to amplify those. Another caution about science is that science is not the be-all, the end-all, even though that's going to be our main focus for the semester together. But I think it's really important to recognize this, that not all issues are scientific. I mean, science does a good job, especially psychological science, on those, behaviors, those ideas, thoughts, feelings, opinions, emotions, attitudes, perceptions that are observable and quantifiable. So many important issues go untouched. In fact, we spend a lot of time taking taking effort into quantifying the things that are not directly observable into observable measures. So the things that are going on into your head. So I can't see emotion going on, but I can ask you about your emotions. I can ask you to self-report about your emotions. So, I've got a second bullet here, and if you look at these, some of these are amazingly important. I mean, is there really a much more important question to all of humanity than does God exist? Great question, amazing question, maybe the most important question of all time. It's a lousy scientific question because to be good science, you have to be able to set up a situation where a hypothesis can either be supported or refuted. All right, it's got to be either be accepted or rejected. Either we reject or we fail to reject. And so, is life meaningful? Is there life on Neptune? Maybe at some point when we have the technology to get to Neptune and do some tests, we might be able to answer that. But right now, with the given technology, I'm not so sure that we can answer that in a way where we could either accept or reject that null hypothesis. Is capital punishment right or wrong? Now, I could do surveys about capital punishment. I could do, a national survey and ask you a bunch of questions about it. But survey research isn't going to answer right or wrong. That's a personal issue. And with all these really important complex issues, there's always going to be multiple sides. And there is no absolute answer, at least not from a scientific perspective. Is a 2-week-old embryo a human being? Science isn't going to be good at that because that's more of a definition. Now, scientists can study what's going on. Is there a heartbeat? Not a heartbeat? The division of cells, and what are those steps? The gamete, the zygote, the embryo. We can study all types of things there, but that's more of a moral decision, a definitional legal decision than it is really about a science. And I don't want to belabor this too much, but we're going to spend the semester talking about things that are quantifiable and kind of dusting off our chops and getting into the skills that it takes to be a researcher and do research methods and utilize research methods properly. But just I think it's fair to acknowledge up here at the front of the course that not everything is scientific. So you're going to have to rely on your own sensory systems, those other ways of knowing about the world that you read about in your textbook. All right, that's it for me and the characteristics of good science. And this is for Psych 321 Research Methods at Boise State University.